about.
Oh gosh, yes.
So we could
We're going to talk about our competitive and our over-the-counter applications, the required information, state objectives, readiness, threshold, scoring. We'll talk a little bit about scoring. So sections shouldn't be quite as long as the last one, but I do want to get us through this as quickly as we can. All right, so state objectives. So in the competitive programs, your state objectives are worth points. You either have them or you don't. In your over-the-counter programs, they are threshold. State objectives is Appendix I. Take a look at it. We have simplified this. Last year, they got really clever, but it was also pretty complicated. I think a lot of folks have a lot of questions about how to use that table. This year, we're kind of drawing it back and just making it very, very clear. What have you done in the last 24 months towards one of these state objectives? If you aren't sure whether or not what you've done would qualify, ask us. We'll let you know. It just has to be something that you can document. So documented proof that you've taken one action towards promoting fair housing and documented proof that you've taken one action towards disaster resiliency in the last 24 months. And it can be something as straightforward as setting up fair housing posters in your county administration or your city hall. It could have been a program or a flyer that you put out. It could have been a master plan that you're partnered on. It could be a master plan that you're currently partnering on. Just something that has documentation showing that you've done something in the last 24 months.
So what is documented mean?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, if you put posters up in your city hall,
You want
a
me to take a
photo
picture of them?
Yeah, that'd be really nice.
Cool.
If you've got a master plan that you're working on and you've completed, you can send your MOU on the plan, you can send your resolution saying you're going to do the plan, you can send your contract showing you've contracted with somebody to do the plan, and you can show your, you can give us your draft, you can give us your outline on your plan. Just something that shows that you've done what you say you've done, right? You say, have we done something? Here's the something we've done. We're going to work on this. This is, we dialed this back because, again, we're changing so much. We didn't want to add another level of complication. We'll be working with HPD in the future to kind of figure out how this needs to work. Maybe get this a little bit more nuanced, but for now, it's just either you did or you didn't. And, if you are looking for something very easy to do, fair housing posters, you can get them from the Fair Housing Administration. Go put those up. The disaster resiliency stuff, I think almost everyone almost everywhere in California has some sort of disaster vulnerability. Yeah. Like if you're on the coast, you're looking at sea level rise. If you're inland, you're looking at wildfires. Like everybody has something they should be looking at.
So in our case, like the city has a yearly contract with Fair Housing. So a copy of the contract?
That'd be great. And what do they do? Just out of curiosity?
They interact with landlords and tenants and give them information, and then they also do educating.
So if you wanted to also give them a scope of their scope of work, or if they give you an annual performance report, I always like to take that kind of stuff back to governing boards and say, hey, here's all the fair housing stuff we did. We offered these trainings and certifications, to kind of help show that this is continue to enforce that this is an important thing. So if you've done one of those, your PowerPoint presentation to your board would work also.
Okay.
Yeah. You only need one incident for each thing, so if you've got multiple things, that's great. You can upload multiple things. We love it, but we're only going to say this is either on or off, right? So either you have it or you don't. Readiness. Okay. So readiness only applies to your competitive applications, and your over-the-counter readiness is really part of your threshold. And we'll talk about what that means when we get into the over-the-counter conversation. The readiness criteria are customized, so we tried to make them specific to the type of activity that you're doing, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But really the primary goal here is to show how ready you actually are to hit the ground running with your activity. So this is the other part of where we've gotten rid of that prior experience requirement. This is going to show us that you've done your narrative, so we know that you know what's involved in your activity. This shows us that you have all of the pieces in place ready to go when you to hit the ground running. So we are in our readiness criteria. I'm going to show you what this looks like for the. Actually, let me go see if I can do this by the PowerPoint. Yay, I'll do this by the PowerPoint. I'll show you in a minute. So for public services, for the public services readiness, this is one of the ones that you're going to see updated because we've added more specific details to make it easier and more transparent. We're going to be looking for your need for the service. We're going to be looking for you to evaluate access to the service. Is there no access because there's just no service provided in your area? Is there no access because you have a service provider but they are so overwhelmed, they have no more capacity? So we're going to be looking for service access, service accessibility, population, and this population component comes up in pretty much every single one of these applications in one way or another. We want to know that you know your population. Who needs the service? Is this a growing population? Is it a shrinking population? Are you losing population because the service isn't available? A common example of that is senior services. In communities where there are no senior services, it's harder for people to age in place, and sometimes the jurisdictions will lose population, lose seniors because there's no services to help them stay, and so they end up going somewhere else. They have to relocate. So we're looking to know that you know your population. There's no right or wrong answer here, right? It's, do you know what you're looking at? That's what we're going to be kind of gauging on. And then leveraged partnerships, and this one is also in a lot of these applications. Are you going to be partnering with other service providers, other districts, jurisdictions? Are you going to have the school district? Are you going to be working with your healthcare providers or local hospitals? Who all are you working with? This is a really good opportunity for you to kind of show us who else is in the community that can be supporting you and doing what you're doing. Code enforcement readiness. So if you're in the public services application, there's a toggle. Is this a code enforcement project? And you're going to be like, come on guys, up in the activity I told you this was senior services. What do you mean this is a code enforcement project? We put that in there to make it so that it was easy for us to delineate the activity. So it's not that we think that you're doing code enforcement for senior services. It's because that was easier from programming. If you turn the code enforcement toggle to no, not a code enforcement project, you get this readiness set of questions. If you tune code enforcement to yes, you get this set of readiness questions. And the goal here was to make it very, very transparent what we would be evaluating for your code enforcement readiness. So it's looking at your population to officer ratio. If you have 1 or 2 officers for a large area, large population, that probably indicates you need additional code enforcement support. Narrative describing needs, your age of housing stock, relating to your housing stock and code enforcement. The narratives will be scored, but it's really going to be how you document what you've done. So it's the documentation that we're going to be looking at. Narrative describing property nuisances with supporting documentation. So one of the changes that we're going to be making before Monday is we're going to add in options for you to load multiple types of supporting documentation. I think right now we only have 1 per. So we're going to go in there and be able to put in like photos showing, and letters showing, and complaints showing, and so multiple types of documentation. And then this last one is kind of a new thing. So this is rental housing protections. Code enforcement often has a disproportionately negative impact on renters, especially in areas where you have a really high renter to owner ratio. So what we'll be looking for is, do you have rental housing protections in your community? Are you doing a fair housing program with a fair housing provider to help provide fair housing support? Are you doing a door fee? Are you doing registration to require that people who are renting out units are registered as property owners? What are you doing to kind of support renter housing to make sure that if you put code enforcement, increase your code enforcement, it's not going to disproportionately impact your renters? This is competitive, so this is not something that you require. It's something that we want you to be thinking about, and as you're thinking about the different types of impacts that your activity might have. Planning readiness. So planning readiness is very similar to public services. It's going to be nuanced a little bit based on what kind of a planning activity you're going to be doing. So we got feedback from previous groups that we needed to have a little bit more nuance in our economic development planning versus our community development planning. So there will be slightly different planning structures for that. But the idea here is that your planning application will let us know that you know why you need the plan, why you're doing the plan, and how the plan will meet a national objective. So one of the questions that we've been getting a lot is, I want to use CDBG to update my housing element. I want to use CDBG to update my master plan. I want to use CDBG to update this plan or that plan. Whenever you're doing it, whenever you're considering a different plan for CDBG, other than like a project-specific pre-development plan, you want to really ask yourself, okay, what's my national objective? So who is this going to help? How does this plan help low and moderate income households, persons, or neighborhoods? And then number two, how am I going to document that it helps low income households, persons, or neighborhoods? So if you're working on a housing element and your jurisdiction is not 51+% low mod, how are you going to document that that housing element is going to support low mod individuals? It might be something you can figure out. You might say, hey, the housing element is going to have this affordable housing plan, it's going to target in this area, it's going to provide. You have to show us, though, that you know how to document that, right? That's not us saying, we'll figure out how to document it for you later. So if you can't figure out how to document that, or if you're looking at kind of, you know, what your political environment is, and you know that your city council, your board of supervisors is not going to be supportive of a housing element that really emphasizes the need for affordable housing and puts in a lot of affordable housing plans and funding and programs, I need to find another funding source for that housing element. If you're working on like a sewer project, a master sewer plan, and you know that your jurisdiction as a whole is not CDBG, but you're going to be updating sewer in low-income areas, well, there's a potential fit there. We can talk with you about how to segment this so that you can make that work. So it really depends on what type of plan you're doing. You're going to want to say, what's the national objective, and how am I going to report on it? How does this meet it, and how do I report on it? Your plan itself does not have beneficiaries. Your plan is for whatever outcome, whatever project, whatever event, whatever work you're going to be doing. And that is what has to have the beneficiaries. And that's what makes housing elements so tricky, right? If your housing element is just an exercise to complete a requirement, and you don't actually have anything that comes out of your housing element, there's no outputs, it's really hard to say, oh yeah, this meets a national objective and it's going to help low-income households because why? There's no outputs, right? Whereas a sewer master plan, a little more direct outputs, right? There will be sewer pipes, they will be bigger, they will improve, sewer access for these households, they'll take these guys off of septic fields or whatever kind of your situation is. So talk with us about this if you have questions. We've gotten a lot of these questions. And typically we're not saying no, hard no. We're saying, explain to us how this will work and how this will be eligible. And if you have a way that it is eligible, we'll work with you to figure it out. Other things that we're going to be looking for, documentation of other resources. So that doesn't just mean financial resources, but it means if you're doing a facility, other facilities, if you're doing infrastructure, what other infrastructure is there available, what other things are already out there, because we want to make sure that we're not doing any sort of duplications, right? If you've got a senior center, and you say we need a senior center, we're going to be like, what? How many senior centers do you need? Do you have a growing senior population? Is it growing enough that you need a second senior center? Does your other senior center have problems? Is it privately owned and you don't have unlimited access? Like, we're going to want to know what's going on with that. And then if you're leveraging, so if you're working with other partners, if you've got other agencies, other districts, school district, sewer district, fire district, water district, you've got other folks working with you on your planning, let us know. This is a good opportunity for us to for you to show us that you're working collaboratively. We like that. Housing program readiness. So this is a good one for me to show you kind of how the system breaks down the readiness to make it a little bit easier for you to identify what you have and haven't done for readiness. So this is the housing application, competitive housing application. So the first readiness question is going to be, do you have a marketing plan? If you select yes, it's going to ask you if your marketing plan has these components. This is what we're going to be scoring on, right, are the components. So does your marketing plan have fair housing protections. And how robust is your fair housing protections in your marketing plan? Does it just say you have to obey fair housing law? Okay, well, minimum points, participation points, yay. Fair housing protections, here's how you submit a claim if you have a fair housing problem. Here's the different types of fair housing situations that commonly arise. This is why you're required to do fair housing, like a more robust conversation of fair housing in your marketing plan. Well, then you're going to get more points, right? So we'll be looking at that for just how thoroughly do you understand what your fair housing obligations are and how you're protecting them. Anti-discrimination plan, similar deal. We'll be looking to make sure that you have as much information as you can about how you're not going to allow folks to discriminate in your CDBG funded programs. That would include your limited English proficiency requirements. We have a little bit of information about that in one of our appendices. And then your target population analysis. And this is really important in these programs because if you don't know who your target population is, or you don't know what their preferences or tolerances are, it can be really hard for you to be successful. If you're running a loan program in a population that is super, super debt averse, your loan program is going to struggle, right? You're going to go to that senior and say, yeah, deferred payment, 30 years, 0%, and they're going to be like, loan? No, I don't, no, I'll let my roof leak, right? So you'll need to know your population. Show that you've done the research to know who's going to be taking this program, who's going to be participating, and what kind of uptake, and what kind of marketing, what kind of outreach, and what kind of program structure do you need. You're allowed to structure your program to meet the needs of your target population, right? So if it's not a loan, they're not going to take loans, they don't want loans, you can do an emergency grant program. You can go in there and just say, okay, well, we're just doing roofs and building envelope. It's going to be grants, no more than $15,000 per household. They have to be income validated, and they have to live there for 5 years. Sweet, we can totally do that. That's an awesome program. But this is important because it means that you know your population. Now, if you just say, yes, our target population will be seniors and families that are low income, then we're going to be like, participation points. Our population is seniors that are super debt averse and that have predominantly live in manufactured housing and have 30-year, 40-year-old units and have a lot of deferred repairs, and this is how we're going to address their debt averseness. That's a much better target population analysis. The next one in here is your HUD compliant underwriting requirements. So we know that a lot of you have been working off of program guidelines that you probably got from HCD at some point. And then maybe you're working off of the combined guidelines that had home and Cal Home and CDBG all in one. And maybe you've noticed that they don't really cover very much of the program operation information that you actually need to operate your program. Maybe you've noticed they're a little hard to work with. We're working on revising those. Those will be out soon, the revised versions. In the meantime, though, we do want to make sure that you understand what is required to operate the program. So just because you have those guidelines doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the points for this, right? We need to know that you have acceptable property criteria for your underwriting. What is the acceptable property criteria? If you're doing loans, if you're doing grants, you're going to say in this, we have acceptable property criteria, we're doing grants, and this is the kind of properties we're going to target, and we're only going to help if it's this level of severity or worse, and if it's not that level of severity, we're going to defer. Like, what's your property criteria, right? For your income qualification criteria, you should have a very clear understanding of what does and doesn't qualify for income and how you're going to evaluate it. Loan to value standards. So if you're doing loans, what is your loan to value standard? What are you structuring there? We want to make sure that you think about that and you have a game plan for that. If you're doing grants, kind of the same deal. Like, how much money are you going to put into a unit? If the unit has zero value, how much grant money are you going to be willing to put towards that? Do you have a loan servicing plan? So if you take more than $750,000 of federal funds, you have to complete a single audit. If you've done a single audit in the last few years, your auditors probably were like, hey, your loan portfolio, what's up with it? and have started to evaluate it. It's really, really important to have a loan servicing plan, to have a game plan for how you're going to administer your loan portfolio. Not only is single audit now looking at that, but we're going to start looking at that as well. That's something that that the HCD had an obligation to monitor and evaluate that we really haven't been monitoring or evaluating. As we build our staff capacity and as we get a little bit better at administering our program, we're going to start really pushing this and moving more towards evaluating this. So we want to make sure that you know what your servicing plan is, right? What are you going to do in the case of default? How do you handle defaults? What if the homeowner dies and leaves the unit to their children? How are you going to handle that? What if they abandon the unit? How are you going to handle that? Long-term servicing obligations. What's your game plan for when you aren't there anymore? You've retired, you've moved on, you've got promoted, and the person who knows how this all kind of worked is no longer there. What's the game plan? How do you manage that portfolio long-term? Loan transfer requirements. Are you going to let folks transfer these loans? If you are, how are you going to structure it? So this is all stuff that's important for you to set up for your unique situation in your unique jurisdiction. If you've got something in there that does not meet federal requirements, we'll let you know. We'll work with you to fix it. What's important here is that you're thinking about this stuff and you're planning for it. So let's go through the rest of these real quick. Here's our housing program. You can tell I designed the PowerPoint around that specific one because it was the most complete. Economic development readiness. Similar deal. When you're looking at your economic development competitive, you're going to be looking for your market analysis. Now your competitive economic development is a little bit different whether you're doing technical assistance or business assistance or microenterprise financial assistance. So you want to make sure you select the correct item for what you're trying to do. But the market analysis is going to follow a lot of the market analysis requirements that have existed in previous NOFAs. That shows that you know what your market is, that what the need is, how you're going to meet it, that you have reasonable demand projections, that you really know what you're doing, and that you're set up to be successful. Okay, so that gets us through our readiness criteria. Any questions? You guys have had the least questions of all of the groups we've worked with so far. So I know I talk fast and sometimes folks don't feel like they can get a word in edgewise.
So when you're looking at the loan servicing plans and some of these ones you just talked about, is this going to be in place of having to submit program guidelines?
No. You're still going to have to submit program guidelines. We're not going to require, they actually are part of the threshold. We're not going to require that they be adopted. We just want you to have a draft in works. Okay. And then once we get our templates done, we'll ship them out. Kind of a little forecasting on what our program templates look like is it has the language, the required information, right? So there's base program required information. And then there's sections where you fill in your jurisdictional structure. Like how you want your program to work. So we've tried to develop them so that they have more flexibility, so that you can actually design your program to meet your target population needs, and you're not forced to use a program that was kind of like top down. You think it should be this, when in reality, the program gives you much more flexibility. The CDBG program gives you much more flexibility. So we're still working on those. We did them in partnership with our redesign group. So Roxanne Cleaner, who's one of our staff people, a nice addition to our team. She's gone in and she started kind of a rough draft, and then we shipped it out to our redesign and they gave us comments, and we did that 3 times. So now we're kind of going to be doing our internal review, and we should hope to have those out probably by the end of March, so that you guys can take a look and start to fill in the blanks and put the pieces together. Spoiler, the pieces that you need for this are the pieces that you will need to complete those. So if you want to just start working on this, it'll allow you to kind of cut and paste and smush it all together into a suitable set of guidelines. Our goal is to have these to you before we actually have your standard agreement to you so that you can hit the ground running.
Okay. So then that kind of helps us in that objective phase too. How realistic is it when we get that standard agreement, are we going to be able to, say, hit the ground running? So if we already have an ongoing program and we just need more money to keep our program going, is it going to be realistic that we'll be able to start when we get our standard agreement, or will we have all these contract setup requirements?
Right.
That's going to take another 90 to...
Yeah, so as we go through the threshold, you're going to realize that almost everything that was in the general conditions has been moved to threshold. So really the only contract setup requirement that you have post-contract is going to be this guideline stuff.
Okay.
So that's part of the reason why we put that in the readiness, so that you're thinking about it and you're starting to work on the draft language so that we can marry this stuff together very quickly and not have this be a massive holdup. And then staff have all kind of heard this. They've sat in enough of these. They know what the expectation is. So I think they're getting ready to go so that when they get this information from you, they can turn around really quickly. So threshold criteria. More question?
So part of this loan servicing and some of these other areas that you just went over, is that going to be a scoring section?
Yes, those are scored.
Okay.
It's to show that you're doing the work.
Okay, so is that something that we could have somebody look at before we submit the application to know if we're going in the right direction?
Yeah. Although do note that if you send it to us and say, hey, does this look right? We're going to put that in the FAQ so that everybody can see it, so they can say, yeah, this looks right, or no, this doesn't look right, because we want to be fair.
Well, yeah. Okay. And that would go through the NOFA questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we provided links in each of those sections to resource documents so you can kind of see what we're looking at.
Okay.
There's a Cal FHA, or not Cal FHA, but there's a Housing Finance Administration book that has a lot of really good information in it. Things like, I don't know, 1,300 pages or something. So we tried to reference the specific sections. But we tried to give you resources so you can kind of see where we're headed.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes in part with us dialing back program regulations to federal baseline and then slowly adding the pieces back on as they're needed so that we can build this to be a fluid and functional and flexible program. So, yeah. Okay, so OTC threshold, so over-the-counter threshold. So I'm going to jump into another application real quick here. Okay, so as you can see in the OTC threshold, we've got our first two state objective questions. Again, these are yes or no. You click yes, it says upload your proof. The next question is, please include a narrative describing contractor. You know what, ED is probably not the right one. Here we go, okay. ED is the right one, because they're almost all exactly the same. There's just a tiny bit of nuance in the different thresholds for the different programs. So if you do have a contractor or a subrecipient that you're going to be working with, our expectation is that you will have them under contract and ready to go when you submit your application. The idea is that is actually part of being ready to go, right? You don't have to go out and procure. We've already done that. We met federal procurement standards. We did procurement training back in, I think, November. So really, we want to see that you have a signed contract. We're not going to be looking at your procurement documents. You don't have to submit those as part of this. We tried to be judicious about what we would and would not be able to review. We didn't want to make it so that we couldn't actually review your application. So hang on to your procurement documents. We'll look at that when we come and visit you for monitoring. But if you're going to have a subrecipient or a contractor working with you, have them under contract, right? And you can structure your contract to say, to conditional the contract financing. So you say, if awarded, we will do all these things. It makes it so that you don't have to go through any additional steps, right? You get awarded the funding, sign your standard agreement. We have a 30-day turnaround that we're expecting from grantees on executing standard agreements. The idea here is to compress all of the things that kept us from being able to spend money immediately.
So some of the problems that I could see with that is, for example, for counties and cities as well as county council, they want to see that standard agreement, or a lot of times when they're looking at the MOU or the contract, I mean, they want to see that. They want to see what it's in there before they will sign off on it.
Yep. Yeah, so that was part of the reason why we included the draft sample, so they can look at the language in advance.
Okay.
Exhibit E, you can actually print out Exhibit E so they can see what's involved in that language. So you can give them a rough draft, a kind of a rough draft template of what your standard agreement is going to look at beforehand to help them kind of address this issue. And then they're going to need to put that conditional language in there. It's kind of an interesting challenge because I know public works programs and public works agencies do this a lot, and councils tend to be okay with it. But when it comes to a community services or community development or economic development, they get antsy. So I think one thing we've been kind of recommending is talk to your public works director, or public works administrator, your public works staff. They can potentially help give you the right kind of language that will make your county council, your city council, your attorneys less antsy.
But I think what she's talking about is not necessarily what the standard agreement looks like, but that they're executing a contract with a contractor for money that we don't have yet.
Right, which is where that conditional language comes in. If awarded, this contract will go into effect at such and such and such and such.
Well, we can cross our fingers.
Yeah. And, this is again, pilot and a pilot, right? So if you guys are getting there and you're like, man, we did our procurement, we did all of our stuff, we followed all the steps, we went to take this to county council, and they just put their foot down and said no. But we've done all of this stuff to get ready up to this point. Let us know that that's the situation. And if that's what if we're hearing over and over and over again, we'll make an adjustment to the threshold item. Right? We have that ability. This is part of evaluating to see how this process works. But we do want you to try first. We want you to see if you can get this to go through and get this sort of forward thinking, forward planning in place.
There we go. I just know that I'm still having an issue on the last year's one because we're going to administer the City of Shasta Lakes rehab program, and I can't get our council to sign off on last year's because we don't have a standard agreement yet. So and I know not everybody has county council issues like I do. I know that, but it's just an ongoing effort.
Yeah, so if that's, give us that kind of feedback, send that into the CDBG NOFA, that's a proposed challenge, and then if you actually do hit that barrier when you're trying to do this, then, because you can condition that on the standard agreement also, right? You can condition the language on execution of the standard agreement with CDBG, right? So if they're still not going to budge because they don't like conditional language or whatever, let us know, send it into the CDBG NOFA inbox, and we'll try to figure out a way to work with that. Because we don't want to shut you down, but we want you to be so close to ready. We want you to be so close. The more stuff that we push where it gets finished after the application is submitted, the longer the delay, right? So, and just for the record, I'm always happy to get on a conference call with anybody, anytime, about anything. Well, not midnight, but most anytime about anything. Like if you want to, get your county council, you want to get your board of supervisors, your city council, you want to invite us up to do a presentation, especially if it's just a day trip. Totally happy to do that. Sometimes talking to us directly helps them feel a little less anxious and a little bit less like they're going to be stuck holding the bag. Because I think that's the issue, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. The next questions are pretty standard. Site control. We're going to answer yes. It's going to say explain it to us, document it, show it to us. Bid, ready, plans, and specs. So the signed agreement, the site control, and the bid ready plans and specs are really your readiness for your over-the-counter applications. The question is, do you have bid ready plans and specs? You say yes. upload a letter from your engineer or architect certifying bid-ready plans and specs. Right, so what we're gonna ask is that you have a letter on appropriate letterhead, whether it's your letterhead or your consultant's letterhead, from your architect or engineer. They should be licensed. They should not be debarred, saying these plans and specs are ready to go to bid. That's all they're saying. These plans and specs are ready to go to bid. We don't want to see your plans and specs. We only have a handful of staff here in the building who know how to read blueprints and read spec books, and that's not a best use of our time. This is your professional putting their licensure, their certification, their name, their reputation, saying, we have this. The next thing is a box. It's verification that you will go to bid. Man, I thought we fixed that typo. Go to bid within 90 days of execution of the standard agreement. So we execute the standard agreement, you have 90 days to go to bid. If you make it, great. That's your first milestone. You're off to the races. If you don't make it, we're going to cancel your award, or we're going to fund the next people down the line in the OTC process. We're taking this off of the tax credits. This is kind of how they do business, and they are very high-performing, very respected. We're working on it. Very, very good group of procedures. We really want this to be taken seriously. 90 days, right? Like, you are seriously ready to go. So, if you don't meet that 90-day go to bid, and your engineer and your architect signed off saying they were ready to go to bid, you've got some questions you've got to ask, right? You've got to be looking at your project. So this is really the key components of your readiness. The next question is, do you have funds, 100% of funds necessary to complete the project? Yes or no? If no, you're going to explain how your activity is going to be completed without all of the funding. And maybe this might sound like this is a hard stop. It's not. Some projects are segmented. You've got 20 miles of sewer that you got to lay, but you're only going after 1 mile, but you did your NEPA on all 20 miles because you're planning ahead, and we like it when you plan ahead. This is where you're going to say, well, the project is X big, and we have segmented it into phases, and we don't have funding for all of it, but we have funding to complete this portion, right? One of the big goals of this program, we have a lot of goals, we're high achievers, is looking to make sure that you are maximizing your resources in terms of NEPA and procurement, which means your NEPA should be all of your project, right? Don't do NEPA on just a certain phase, and then you got to go do NEPA on the next phase, the next phase. One NEPA, all the project. NEPA is good for 5 years, potentially longer if your conditions don't change and you can just do a minor update. Ditto to procurement, right? Procure for as much as you can, condition your contract. That way you're not re-procuring every single step of the way, and you get the advantage of having somebody who knows your project already under contract, ready to rock and roll from phase 1 to phase 2. So when we're talking about whether or not you have all of your funds, this is a multi-phase, huge project. The answer is probably going to be no, but that's okay, because you're going to explain to us how you're going to get the part that you do have funding for completed, right? So that's really your OTC, the OTC component readiness, where there's a little bit of difference between your OTC and your competitive. The rest of this is all samesies, competitive and OTC. So debarment check. We want you to do the debarment checks. Yeah.
In the readiness training, we talked about pre-development application that would be OTC for housing projects, but that doesn't exist. Or does exist.
So let's talk about that for a little bit, because when we talked about the redesign, we did talk about pre-development, and I think every time we started it, we're like, this is super high risk. It's really risky. It's so risky. It's way more risky than a conditional contract because you trigger performance timelines on that pre-development. It's available, can do it. We're only going to fund 2, if that, this time around. We really don't want you to do them. We kind of put this in as a compensation when we were doing the redesign because we were worried that the redesign was going to unfairly make it extra difficult for lower resource jurisdictions to participate in the OTC. We feel we've really compensated for that in two other ways that are way less risky. One of them is pre-agreement costs, and the other one is increasing the planning grant component. So planning grants are now maxed out at $250,000. We've put, I think, $6 million in there for planning activities for these projects. We are allowing you to take your planning all the way up to completed plans and specs.
Okay, so that was my next question.
Yeah, so we'd much rather you use that than come in for pre-development because it doesn't carry the same performance risk.
Okay.
That said, if the planning is just not an option for you and you think you think you can come in and do one of the two pre-developments that we might do this year, talk to us, communicate with us. Like, we need to talk about that to make sure that we set you up so that you don't end up with the risk of non-performance on your plate. We'd rather you do this through pre-development costs and through planning. Yeah. It was one of the ideas, so the redesign's been kind of an evolution, and it was one of the ideas we came up with kind of early on, and then we told folks about it, and then it was like, well, you gotta do what you say you're gonna do. So we're doing what we said we're gonna do, but we're gonna try and find better ways to do it because we don't want you to be at that level of risk if we can help it.
So the PTAs are up to 250,000?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Plans and specs. If you're doing, so this is actually a great time to talk about this. Yeah, so if you want to do PTA and get you through plans and specs, this is how your scope of work narrative is going to look, and this is how you're going to structure this thing. You're going to say, okay, PTA, step one, we're going to identify our site, we're going to identify our potential sites, do a lot of kind of our feasibility. So you'll do your feasibility step one. Step two, you're going to do your NEPA, right? Step two, NEPA. Step three, procure. If you haven't already, you're going to procure your engineer, your architect. You might have already procured them as part of your concepts. That's fine, just be sure to follow federal procurement. You're going to get that NEPA done, right? And then you're going to go finish your plans and specs. So when you're all done with this planning, this $250,000 planning activity, or however much it costs you, because some of them will cost that, but I think most of them probably will come in a little bit lower. You're going to have a complete feasibility, a completed NEPA, and you're going to have completed 100% design plans and specs. So that when you come in on the next OTC, you check that box, ready to bid in 90 days, and you mean it. You're for serious. So that's our recommendation. The planning grants are competitive, but at $6 million and $250 a pop, we're going to have a few of them. So we hope that you take that into consideration and take that as an option. The pre-development costs are also eligible, so if your costs are incurred, if they were federally procured, first of all, so you met federal procurement standards, and then you incurred them within 6 months of submitting your application, those costs are potentially eligible and can be reimbursed. Right? So if you've already kind of been rocking and rolling on your project, this is an opportunity to get full coverage, full cost recovery on your project, and we'll show you how in the budgets when we get to the budgeting section here, because there is a process we want to follow on that. But yeah, if you have no other resource, talk to us. We'll get you set up with the pre-development, but if we can come up with any other way of doing it, we'd rather do it a way that doesn't involve that much risk. Because the last thing we want is anybody, we don't want you paying back money, we want you spending money.
That's right.
Okay, department check. So one of the questions we've got is, do I have to run a department check on every single person who works for the county? The answer is no. Run department checks on your agencies. So you're going to run a department check on your organization. You're running a department check on your subrecipient organization if you've got them, your consultant if you've hired them, if you have any other third-party contracts on them as an organization. Please don't run department checks on every individual. That will kill us all. It turns into a huge effort. If you've never done this before, let us know. We can show you how, but hopefully you've been running a department check before you hired stuff like, attorneys or large-scale contractors. This just lets you know that they are eligible to work with federal funding. Next questions. Statement of assurances and compliance with 2 CFR Part 200. So that's Appendix J. You're going to pull that out. You're going to read it through. You're going to click the links. You're gonna have it executed, it needs to be signed, and then it needs to be uploaded here.
We see that's a say that says appendix H.
Oh, it's supposed to be appendix J. Okay, so other typo. See, this is why we didn't lock it up. Because you find stuff. One of the things we tried to do in the NOFA and in the appendixes is whenever we had a citation or a reference to a certain HUD form or a document or guidance, that we put a link in there so that you can check and see what those things actually say. And that way, so if you have an issue or a concern or a question, you can say, oh yeah, I need to talk with you about 2 CFR 200, you know, part 317. And then your rep or I or whoever you have on the line can be like, oh, okay, we know what we're looking at, what's your question? This is part, again, dialing it back, so that we're working on baseline regs. So we tried to put that in everything. I think I found a couple of places where we didn't update the citations or include the citations as links, but you know, never hesitate to Google a citation if you're trying to figure out what it says or if it applies, and we'll work with you if you have questions. The next section is your citizen participation. Have you met your public hearing citizen participation requirements? I believe this is Appendix C. Yeah. So this is Appendix C. We have aligned our citizen participation requirements with the federal requirements. So that's 2 public hearings, public meetings, however you decide to notice them, just 2 publicly noticed, publicly accessible events during the life cycle of your grant. One of them needs to be pre-application. The other one can be later. I personally, we as a department would love to have you do that at completion because it's an opportunity for you to present your final results. But if you have it at some other point in time, that can be also okay. The key component is that it is publicly noticed. It's available to the public. You give the public notice enough time for folks to actually see it and attend the meeting, so no 24-hour notices. And that your notice contains information about where the meeting will be held and what the meeting will be about, so folks know whether or not they should attend. The public notice information is in that Appendix C. There's a list of things that we want to see in there. We used to have a very prescriptive list, and your public notice got kicked out if it wasn't in there. That's not a federal requirement. The federal requirement is that you have that information available to the public at some point. You can have it on a PowerPoint at the meeting when they show up. It can be on a handout, it can be in an agenda, it can be in a flyer, it can be in a notice, it can be on a postcard, right? There's a lot of ways you can present that information. It doesn't have to be in your public notice. We don't want to be kicking things out for, like, that's just not functional for us. It's not a good way to get the money out the door. So when you do your proof of public notice and you upload that, it's probably going to be your public notice and your however else you got the information out to the public, whether it's a PowerPoint or a PDF or a handout or like how did you share the information about the program?
So do you want like a proof of publication from the newspaper?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, still. Got it.
So Jessica, because we've had a lot of questions, going a little bit about, in the past you've always required to put the dollar amount that you're applying for, very specific, so, because it's new for...
Yeah, so you can still put that in there if you want to. My recommendation would put a nice high not to exceed with lots of zeros, make it very kind of estimated not to exceed, and then add like $500,000 on top of it just in case. Like we're not looking for to the dollar amount components in your public notice. That makes it really restrictive for you, right? Now all of a sudden you have a limit and you try to go $1 over and it's like, stop. So there is a little bit of information that does need to be included in your public notice, but you can be fairly general. What you do want to do is make sure that the public knows that this is the kind of activities you're looking for information about and they should come participate, right? Like we are going to be applying for CDBG grant funds to do a range of activities, and that might include sewer and housing and public services and youth services, senior services, a facility. Like what things are you thinking about doing so that they come and engage with you and say, here's feedback, here's what we know we need. Okay.
So the example that you put in the citizens participation plan, you're not looking for that specific wording.
No, you can just get the information in there.
Okay.
Because I think, a lot of those public notices, I mean, it's really easy for them to run $400, $500, $600
Exactly.
because they're huge.
Yes.
When in reality, the information is, this is CDBG, there's some money available, we can do some certain kinds of activities, we want you to come talk with us about it, here's where you need to show up, and here's who you contact if you have special accommodation needs.
So there's no, okay, so I just want to make sure. So there's no once a year, this is what you can take input in, and then again when we're applying, and then again at the end, it's just.
So no design phase, no submittal phase, it's one pre-application.
Pre-application. Pre-application. Now, you do still have to do a resolution to submit your
Right.
application.
Right.
And if you want to do that as a public hearing, as a second public hearing, or as a,
Yes.
you're absolutely okay to do that. If you want to do that on consent calendar, and because you've already done your publicly noticed public hearing, and you've got your public input, you can do it there. Like, either one of those works. It's up to you, how you want to do it. You're welcome to do more than 2 public meetings, public hearings.
Oh, that's what we want to do.
You're federal.
Yeah.
You do. One of them has to be before application.
Okay, in the past, they had to be 30 days apart.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hold my eyes.
Thank you. So they don't have to be 30 days apart, we just have to hold 2 meetings.
Yeah, so here's the one caveat, right?
Yes.
So you hold your public hearing, public meeting, and you've got your PowerPoint, and you talk about all the different projects you're gonna do, and about how much money each one's gonna cost, and how you're going to, like, just the way that you would structure any other public meeting where you were going to solicit and inform your public, like solicit information and inform. And then you come in for your application, and it's got something completely unrelated. You never exposed it to your public.
Right.
Okay, now you're gonna need to publicly notice that.
Okay.
Right? That's a bait and switch. No bait and switch.
Right.
So if you're adding something into your application that was not involved, that had no other public vetting, no prior public vetting, well, publicly notice that hearing then, so that you can do that legitimately. Because you don't want to be putting some on your application that the public's never seen. But if you've got all the things that you might potentially do in that initial public meeting, public hearing, and you've gone over it, you talked about it, and you had amounts, and it shows up, and that's what's on your application, on that resolution for applications, then you've done what you were required to do.
So there is no 30 days between the 2 meetings anymore.
Because it's one at the beginning and then you do one clear at the end.
Right. Yeah.
Hopefully this makes life easier. I just know it's
Yes.
confusing because we've been so prescriptive in the past.
Yes.
That was really
And it has to say this, and if it doesn't say this, then you
get
get
kicked back.
And you have to do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't want you doing it again.
And
We just want you to do it
$500 a
once.
pop in the newspaper. Yeah.
Well, and the amount of time that it takes to staff a public meeting, and yes.
And our board of directors just loves to do things twice, and so because we messed up.
Yeah, so it's not a federal requirement, so let's just do what the federal requirement is. I would strongly recommend that y'all go in and click the link and read what the federal requirement is. We have it. The citation, 24 CFR 570-486, I think. It's like 486G or something.
That's in Appendix C, you have it listed.
Yeah, so go look in there and read that citation, and that's what we're gonna be holding you to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was a very descriptive full page. This is what an example of the first.
If you want it, well, that's
Notice.
just, we used what we
Okay.
had last year because it has everything in the kitchen
Right.
sink. If you want to use that, just to have everything in the kitchen sink, we salute you one more time.
Okay.
If you want to dial it back and just put in the minimum information,
Okay.
you're responsible for making sure that you get the minimum information in there.
And the minimum information is here.
It's in that citation. Go look at that citation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, so we did ours probably over a year ago because we were expecting to, for the NOFA to be released. Is that still okay, or do you guys prefer that something be done?
Have you changed your activities?
No.
Then you're fine. Yeah. If you haven't changed your activities, then you're fine. If If you change your activities, or if you substantially change the scope of work, or the beneficiaries, or who you were going to help, if you were changing things, then you probably want to get that back in front of the public. But if you haven't changed things, then you think you've done that component. And if you used previous document versions, we're not going to penalize you. We tried to make things simpler, so a lot of these are dialed back. If you use the more robust versions.
So that's what we got one.
Yeah, no harm, no foul. All right, resolution. So you do need to have a resolution. It does need to be adopted or approved, however you do your resolutions. We would like you to use the template that we provided. I'm going to fix it. If you've already used it, it's fine. If you use the fixed one, that is also fine. The only change in there that is going to be substantial for most folks is that the resolution said that we were still requiring match for planning grants, and we aren't requiring match. So I was going to take that piece out. I was going to do it yesterday, but I got sick, so stuff happens. But we'll be taking that out and updating that, and we'll put that in, let you know that that's been updated in the notes section in the files.
And the resolution can have multiple programs or projects on the resolution.
Yeah, so you can do
Doesn't have to be
it.
specific.
Right, so you can do your resolution one of different ways. And you might want to consider doing it these different ways depending on when you're applying and what you're applying for. You can list the activities you are applying for in one resolution, and you'll just upload that resolution with each activity, right? You'll have to make sure you provide documentation with each activity. If you're doing competitive and OTC, and your OTC, you're going to submit your application in March, and your competitive application's you're not going to submit that until early April, then you might want to do two resolutions, right? You might want to say, we'll do this one for the competitive and this one for the OTC, space them out, So you decide how you want to do that. You know how to best communicate with your board and your council, and you determine how you want to engage with them on this. If one resolution does it for you, sweet. If you need more than one, also sweet. Just make sure that it identifies the correct activities and the estimated, and I like these words, not to exceed amount. And we'll talk about budgets later on, and we'll talk about how to get to that right not to exceed amount. So you're going to want to upload your TIN, and I think this is one of the links that we've realized we need to update, so we'll be updating that link.
We're going to load, the TIN form will be on the solicitations page with the rest of those other documents, so you just go in and get it. I'll have that done for you tonight.
And then single audit findings. So single audit response, yes, no, NA. You're not required to submit a single audit. We've had a lot of questions about single audit. The assumption is not that you have, where we are in the timing of the year, you may not have had your single audit fully accepted and fully processed. So you might be kind of partial in your processing of your single audit. That's okay. Give us what you have. We want to see whatever your most recently completely executed single audit document is. I like that they kept trying. That's determination for you.
So if it's NA, do you want the letter? Got it.
Yeah.
Probably go in there. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you select NA, we're gonna say, show us that you're NA, right? So we know. If you have audit findings, or you have audit resolution items that you know of, because you've already done the processing, we want to see that. If you don't, it's going to be NA, that's okay. We're really looking to make sure that you are aware of your single audit situation. This is both a state and a federal requirement. In the past, we've relied on the state controller's office to provide these to us. Sometimes they get behind, and by the time we realize you have a problem, we are already well into another $3 million award. That's not a good place for any of us to be in, so we're looking to you to provide the
So
documentation.
you're talking about more than just the OMB form or signature?
If you're exempt to be?
Yeah.
No, I think it's just the OMB form that says that you're,
Okay.
yeah. Would there be more than that?
I don't know. That's in the past, there's always been that. I just didn't know.
Yeah,
if there was
I
something
didn't
more.
know that there was anything more than that.
Yeah, it's just a letter to the controllers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you can look up on the controller's site
Yeah.
show that you exempt.
if they have kept it up to date and haven't fallen behind. Sometimes they fall behind too, and this is in part part of the reason why we're doing this is in response to that. We got our, was it maybe 2017 single audits? And we were like, oh, spaghetti with a couple of jurisdictions. Because we've already made them 2017 and 18 awards. So we're looking to you to help us with this. Program monitoring. So I know some of you have been monitored. We're starting to really kind of come out and do more monitoring. This is looking for to make sure the monitoring stuff's been resolved or that you know it's in resolution. If you've got a really old monitoring and you don't know whether or not it was resolved, reach out and talk to us. One of the things that we are doing this cycle, and only this cycle, is we are not penalizing on late reports and we're not penalizing on unresolved stuff. Unless, of course, you've got like a single audit finding that's repeated year after year after year and you still haven't fixed it, that's probably going to be a no-go. But if you have a CDBG monitoring from 2012 that you never really resolved, well, let's talk about it, let's get it into resolution, but we're not going to penalize you on it. If you haven't submitted your program income reports, and most of you probably haven't because we haven't been asking for them for this last cycle, that's not a penalty, right? You're okay. Everybody's in the clear. Moving forward, things are going to change. It's going to be a lot more oriented towards performance. We're going to be looking and saying, have you completed all of your reporting? Have you been making quarterly draw requests and quarterly progress updates? Have you been meeting your milestones? Have you been expending your money according to your expenditure deadline? What kind of performance has been happening moving forward? In the past stuff, past is in the past. Okay. Yes, here we go. Compliance with all existing HCD award agreements. So we're, again, relying on you to know what HCD awards you have and whether or not you're in compliance with those agreements, whether or not you have open monitoring findings. Just because you do is not a hard no. It just means you need to tell us what's going on. Right? Just help us understand what your situation is. Be in repayment for any non-compliance, overdue semi-annual, annual grant reports, proof of NEPA compliance. So if you're doing a statutory worksheet, we're looking for the statutory worksheet. We're making sure that you have your citations in the information boxes on the statutory worksheet. You've completed all the check boxes. You've got a good project description. If you need help on how to come up with a good project description, visit HUD's website. They've got good training on that. It needs to be robust. Your project description should include all of the project. A water well is not a project description. That's a project title. Right? A water well that will go X number of feet deep, located at this place, digging into this type of soil, that will serve this type of population, that's going to be located and oriented like this, with this kind of pump situation, like that's a description. So make sure that your NEPA has a good description of your project. We're really going to be looking at that and monitoring moving forward. So if you've got just a statutory worksheet and it converts to exempt, or you've got, that's the information. If you're doing an environmental assessment, we're not looking for your entire environmental review record. We're looking for your EA. We're looking for your mitigations. We're looking for your published FONSI. We're looking for your consultations, if you have your SHPO consultation or tribal consultations. We're looking for your kind of base documentation that shows that you did what you were supposed to do. We don't need to see your entire environmental review record file. Sometimes those get really, really big, and we won't have capacity or time to look at it. There's no file size limit on this upload, but that's just more than we need to look at. We would really, really like it if you are doing an OTC project to have your FONSI and Notice of Intent to Request Release of Funds published, right? Like have all of that done. You can even have your request for release of funds ready to go. So the only thing you need now is your authority to use grant funds from HCD. The reason we want this published is that public comment or public response on a FONSI can eat up time really fast. And that 90-day window where you said you were going to be ready to go to bid, that can just disappear. I was joking, you can eat, like a FONSI or a NEPA issue can eat that like a cookie. It just disappears. And all of a sudden you're in violation of the 90 days and now we have to re-award your funds to someone else. So if you're published in advance, you're done, right? It's gonna be really hard for something to come unforeseen in your NEPA and cause you problems and cause you delay. Some folks, some jurisdictions, they're not super comfortable with that. So that's okay. This round, if you're not published, but you're ready to publish, we'll accept it. Just know that you're running the additional risk, right? Because that 90-day clock will start ticking. And then you'll publish, and then if you get comments that cause delay, or you have to do additional consultation, or some other thing happens, that one's gonna be on you, right? So, and we won't be doing any extensions for that, because we've had this conversation now. So, any questions on that?
So you're saying to publish the request for release of funds if you're doing over-the-counter, but not if you're doing a competitive?
So in competitive, really the only time that you would have anything more substantial than a categorical exception not subject to might be housing if you were doing a regional environmental review or some sort of tiered review. We'd like you to get as far on that as you can. That would be really nice if you can get as far on that as you can. Everything else is going to convert to exempt, I think, probably. My brain's not fully on today, so.
Yeah. Well, so like in the rehab, we've had to do the environmental review, and then we've had to do publish the request for release of funds.
Yeah, so if that's what you've done, then we'd like you to be at that same level of readiness for this also.
Okay.
If you did a 5-year environmental review and you did that 2 years ago, it's good, you're done. Just upload it.
So if we did it for home?
Yeah, home is federal.
So, okay. So if we have one for home, that's still good.
Yeah, the home also applies. So home, CDBG, ESG, those all use Part 58. So if you
Even though it
use-
says home funds? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to roll my eyes again. Yes, it's good. So the one challenge that you might have is if it says only home funds.
Yeah.
So you might need to republish it and say, we're going to add CDBG funds in here. It doesn't substantially change the environmental impact. Adding a new funding source does not change
Okay.
environmental impact. You're not changing the scope of your description. So you might need to republish in that event. If you only have HUD funds in there, or home funds in there. A way to get around that is when you're preparing your larger environmental review, say, okay, what federal funding sources might we add?
Yeah.
All right, USDA, CDBG, home, EPA, what else are we gonna put in there? Okay, let's make sure this meets all of those standards.
Okay.
And then as those funding sources become available, you can plug them in and away you go.
Right. Thank you.
I have 2 questions from a jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Okay, the first question, should we file a combined FONSI or NOI at the same time?
Yeah, you can do those at the same time.
The second question is, would it be an issue posting the FONSI and the NOI before city conducts their public meeting to approve submittal of the CDBG application?
Oh, that's a good question. So, probably perfect world answer would be better to have the public input first, because once you've noticed, you've kind of announced that project and you're not, it kind of puts the cart before the horse. If in this particular situation, that's what you've already done, it's what you've already done. It's kind of where you are. As long as you've met the letter, you're going to be fine. Best practice, though, would be to have your public hearing first. Yeah. I like, that was a good question. Okay, so the next section, housing element. So our housing policy division here at HCD looked at our stuff and said, asked me to loosen this up a little bit. So I'm going to be updating the NOFA language on the housing element to loosen it up a little bit. What we're really looking for here in the housing element stuff is that you all are working towards getting your housing elements up together and certified. We want you to have good housing elements. We want to support you in that. We're not going to penalize you. So be looking for updated language on that soon, hopefully today. I gave it to them early this week, so it should be done. The last thing is something we're putting, it was in the original application, and at some point when we did one of our application updates, it got lost. But we're going to be asking you to upload a activity budget, and we'll talk about that when we get into the budget component. But there will be 2 budget uploads. Okay. I think I cruised through all of this. Oh, so we talked about our threshold changes. Fonzie, notice of intent to request release of funds. We want you to be published. You want to see documentation for everything. We want to see your proofs. If you're not sure what you have suffices as proof, contact us. Threshold is not competitive, right? So we can talk with you about it. We want to see your contracts. Oh, this is important. So, if a threshold item is required and you mark no on it, that you didn't do it, we're going to just disqualify your application because you didn't meet threshold. Initially, we had intended to plan the system so that it wouldn't allow you to submit if you didn't have threshold, but we realized that that actually made it too restrictive and it made it very, very difficult to come up with a more universal format, and we wanted to use a more universal template. So you can actually select no on a threshold item and still hit submit. And then we're going to look at it and be like, but you didn't meet threshold. So back to you. So before you select no on a threshold item, if you aren't sure, contact us, ask us. When your application gets disqualified, so if it's an OTC application, we're just going to kick it back to draft, which means you lose your place in line, but we don't eliminate your application. If it's a competitive application, it's out. Peace out. So make sure that you're thoughtful as you're doing that, and if you have any questions, ask us. All right, so let's talk about our readiness scoring a little bit. So there's really 2 parts to how we're going to be scoring these applications. There's a set needs score, that's in Appendix A, and there's 2 parts to Appendix A this time. There's your actual Excel scores and an Excel file, and then there's a PDF that has our needs methodology, so you can see how we came up with those scores. This is all effort to be more transparent. And then you have your readiness scores. We're proposing a weight scoring of 20% to the needs, 80% towards the readiness. We have not locked in our scoring yet because we were allowing folks to help us fix the application. We didn't want to have to go in and change scoring every time we updated a field in the application. So once we have the application locked in, we'll finish the scoring. We have it all drafted, we just need to make sure that it ties in. And then we're going to publish that as an Appendix L in the list of files on the NOFA. So you'll get an update saying, hey, Appendix L is up, look at your scoring, so you see how the scoring is going to work. But the bulk of the scoring points will be on readiness, so that's a really good place to start your focus. On the need scores on the Appendix A, we did something different this time. So instead of scoring on a curve with a flat need score, we created need scores for the different types of activities that you have, right? So if your jurisdiction scores really high on public services, but really low on housing, well, that's kind of an encouragement for you to go after public services, right? You're going to be more competitive for public services. The flat need score made it a little bit difficult for you to target your specific needs, and we want you to target your specific needs. One of the big goals of the consolidated plan and the action plan, which are the documents that govern our HUD funding, is that they are need related, they're need targeted. So we wanted you to have the ability to also be need targeted as you're thinking about what applications to go for. And also it makes it so that you're not automatically disqualified or automatically out of the running on everything just because you have a need score that averages out low, when in fact you may have a very high public services need or a very high housing need, right? So the need scores are all kind of based. Take a look at that, see what that looks like. If this is a huge change for us, and this is something we're going to be evaluating to make sure that it is effective in how we evaluate your activities, so that we don't accidentally not fund people who really need it because our scoring wasn't effective. If you have questions or concerns about the scoring, or you feel it's not transparent, once we put that Exhibit L up, let us know. Right? We're working on making this effective for you, so your feedback is super critical. Okay, appendices. So use our appendices to the highest extent possible. Some of them got pretty thoroughly updated. Some of them, we just kind of recycled them because they didn't really change very much. Appendix A, your needs scores, as we mentioned, big change, so take a look at that. Appendix C, public participation, big change, take a look at that. The resolution has changed, you'll want to use the new one, and we'll let you know when we fix that last little section in there. Appendix J is all new. This used to just be something that was in the Excel file in your application. This one is super important. Appendix K, we've never released standard agreement with our NOFA, so again, all new. And then we've tried to do our hyperlinks, as I mentioned. So, 5-minute break or 10-minute break. In the past, we've just been keeping these things running, and we kind of just get folks out a little bit